Part 3, Improvisation in Homage to Stravinsky, The Call of the Past. In a 1931 radio lecture, Schoenberg speaks of his masters. In the first place, Bach and Mozart. In the second, Beethoven, Wagner, Brahms. In concise, aphoristic remarks, he goes on to specify what he learned from each of these 5 composers. Between the Bach reference and the others, there is a very great difference. In Mozart, for example, he learns about, quote, the art of unequal phrase lengths, end of quote, or, quote, the art of creating secondary ideas, end of quote. That is to say, an utterly individual skill that belongs to Mozart alone. In Bach, he discovers principles that had also operated in all the music for centuries before Bach. First, quote, the art of inventing groups of notes such that they provide their own accompaniment, end of quote. And second, quote, the art of creating the whole from a single kernel, end of quote. These 2 sentences summarizing the lesson Schoenberg drew from Bach and from his predecessors can be taken to describe the whole 12-tone revolution. In contrast to classical music and romantic music, which are built on the alternation of differing musical themes occurring one after the other, both a Bach fugue and a 12-tone composition from beginning to end developed from a single kernel, which is both melody and accompaniment. 23 years later, when Roland Manuel asks Stravinsky, what are your major interests these days? The latter responds, Guillaume de Machaut, Heinrich Itzhak, Dufay, Peyrotin, and Webern. It is the first time a composer proclaims so firmly the immense importance of the music of the 12th, the 14th, and the 15th centuries and relates it to modern music, to Webern's. Some years after that, Glenn Gould gives a concert in Moscow for the students of the conservatory. After playing Webern, Schoenberg, and Krenek, he gives his audience a short commentary saying, quote, the greatest compliment I can give this music is to say that the principles to be found in it are not new, that they are at least 500 years old, end of quote. Then he goes on to play 3 Bach fugues. It was a carefully considered provocation. Socialist realism, then the official doctrine in Russia, was battling modernism in the name of traditional music. Glenn Gould meant to show that the roots of modern music, forbidden in communist Russia, go much deeper than those of the official music of socialist realism, which was actually nothing but an artificial preservation of romanticism in music. The 2 halves. The history of European music covers about 1,000 years if I take as its beginnings the first experiments in primitive polyphony. The history of the European novel, if I take as its start the works of Rabelais and Cervantes, covers about 4 centuries. When I consider these 2 histories, I cannot shake the sense that they developed in rhythms resembling, so to speak, the 2 halves of a soccer game. The caesuras, or halftime breaks, in the history of music and in that of the novel do not coincide. In the history of music, the break stretches over a big part of the 18th century, the symbolic apogee of the first half occurring in Bach's The Art of Fugue and the start of the second half in the works of the earliest classical composers. The break in the history of the novel comes a little later, between the 18th and the 19th centuries, that is, between Laclos and Sterne on the one side and on the other Scott and Balzac. This asynchronism shows that the deepest causes governing the rhythm of the history of the arts are not sociological or political, but aesthetic, bound up with the intrinsic nature of one art or another, as if the art of the novel, for instance, contained 2 different potentialities, 2 different ways of being a novel, that could not be worked out at the same time, in parallel, but could be worked out only successively, one after the other. The metaphor of the 2 halves of a game came to me some time ago in the course of a conversation with a friend and does not claim to be at all scholarly. It is an ordinary, elementary observation, naively obvious. When it comes to music and the novel, we are all of us raised in the aesthetic of the second half. A mass by Ockeghem or Bach's The Art of Fugue are, for the average music lover, as difficult to comprehend as Webern's music. However enchanting their stories, the novels of the 18th century intimidate the reader by their form, to the point where they are much better known in movie adaptations, which necessarily denature both their spirit and their form, than through their written texts. The works of the 18th century's most famous novelist, Samuel Richardson, cannot be found in bookstores and are practically forgotten. Balzac, on the contrary, even though he may seem old-fashioned, is still easy to read. His form is comprehensible, familiar to the reader, and even more important, it is for that reader the very model of the novel form. The chasm between the aesthetics of these two halves makes for a multitude of misunderstandings. Vladimir Nabokov, in his book on Cervantes, gives a provocatively negative opinion of Don Quixote. Overvalued, naive, repetitive, and full of unbearable and implausible cruelty. That, quote, hideous cruelty, end of quote, makes this book, quote, one of the most bitter and barbarous ever penned, end of quote. Poor Sancho, moving along from one drubbing to another, loses all his teeth at least 5 times. Yes, Nabokov is right. Sancho loses too many teeth, but we are not in the world of Zola, where some cruel act described precisely and in detail becomes the accurate document of a social reality. With Cervantes, we are in a world created by the magic spells of the storyteller who invents, who exaggerates, and who is carried away by his fantasies, his excesses. Sancho's 300 broken teeth cannot be taken literally, no more than anything else in this novel. Madame, a steamroller has just run over your daughter, end of quote. Quote, yes, I'm in the bathtub. Slide her to me under the door, end of quote. Must we bring charges of cruelty against that old Czech joke from my childhood? Cervantes' great founding work was alive with the spirit of the non-serious, a spirit that was later made incomprehensible by the romantic aesthetic of the second half, by its demand for plausibility. The second half not only eclipsed the first, it repressed it. The first half has become the bad conscience of the novel and especially of music. Bach's work is the best known example. Bach's renown during his lifetime, Bach forgotten after his death, forgotten for half a century. The slow rediscovery of Bach over the length of the 19th century. Beethoven alone almost succeeded toward the end of his life, that is 70 years after Bach's death, in integrating Bach's experience into the new aesthetic of music, his repeated efforts to insert fugue into the sonata. Whereas after Beethoven, the more the Romantics worshipped Bach, the further they moved away from him in their structural thinking. To make him more accessible, they subjectivized and sentimentalized him, Busoni's famous arrangements. Then, reacting against that romanticism, came a desire to recover his music as it was played in its own time, which gave rise to some notably insipid performances. It seems to me that, having once passed through the desert of oblivion, Bach's music still keeps its face half-veiled. History as a landscape emerging from the mists. Rather than discuss the forgetting of Bach, I could turn my idea around and say Bach is the first great composer who, by the enormous weight of his work, compelled the audience to pay attention to his music even though it already belonged to the past. An unprecedented phenomenon because until the 19th century, people lived almost exclusively with contemporary music. They had no living contact with the musical past. Even if musicians had studied the music of previous times, and this was rare, they were not in the habit of performing it in public. During the 19th century, music of the past began to be revived and played alongside contemporary music and to take on an ever greater presence, to the point that in the 20th century, the balance between the present and the past was reversed. Audiences heard the music of earlier times much more than they did contemporary music, and now the latter has virtually disappeared from concert halls. Bach was thus the first composer to establish his place in the memory of later generations. With him, 19th century Europe not only discovered an important part of music's past, it also discovered music history. Europe saw that Bach was not just any past, but rather a past that was radically different from the present. Thus, musical time was revealed abruptly, and for the first time, not just as a series of works, but as a series of changes, of eras, of varying aesthetics. I often imagine him in the year of his death, in the exact middle of the 18th century, bending with clouding eyes over the art of fugue, a composition whose aesthetic orientation represents the most archaic tendency in Bach's oeuvre, which contains many orientations, a tendency alien to its time, which had already turned completely away from polyphony toward a simple, even simplistic style that often verged on frivolity or laziness. The historical position of Bach's work therefore reveals what later generations had begun to forget, that history is not necessarily a path climbing upward toward the richer, the more cultivated, that the demands of art may be counter to the demands of the moment, of this or that modernity, and that the new, the unique, the inimitable, the previously unsaid might lie in some direction other than the one everybody sees as progress. Indeed, the future that Bach could discern in the art of his contemporaries and of his juniors must to his eyes have seemed to collapse. When, toward the end of his life, he concentrated exclusively on pure polyphony, he was turning his back on the tastes of his time and on his own composer's sons. It was a gesture of defiance against history, a tacit rejection of the future. Bach, an extraordinary crossroads of the historical trends and issues of music. Some 100 years before him, another such crossroads occurs in the work of Monteverdi. This is the meeting ground of two opposing aesthetics. Monteverdi calls them prima and seconda pratica, the one based on erudite polyphony, the other programmatically expressive on monody. And it thus prefigures the move from the first to the second half. Another extraordinary crossroads of historical trends, the work of Stravinsky. Music's 1,000-year history, which over the course of the 19th century was slowly emerging from the mists of oblivion, suddenly toward the middle of our own century, 200 years after Bach's death, stood revealed in its full breadth like a landscape drenched in light. A unique moment when the whole history of music is totally present, totally accessible and available, thanks to historical research, to radio, to recordings, totally open to the examination of its meaning. This moment of vast reappraisal seems to find its monument in the music of Stravinsky.